If you liked the video, feel free to subscribe. It would really help the channel, and we have battle reports, boarding actions, and list videos. Thanks for watching. Thanks for stopping by. This is part 2 of the Adeptus Custodes Deployment Guide. Part 2 has Search and Destroy and Tipping Point. I have a Talons of the Emperor list with tanks and a Shield Host Custodes with All Infantry as our Custodes deployment examples. The Tau will be our ranged army example. The World Eaters will be our fast melee army example. For lists that have combined arms, we usually deploy the same as we're playing a ranged heavy list, just so we're not losing any models turn 1. If they have any guns, we usually want most of our army in some line of sight cover. In part 2, I want to look at a few more things other than just looking at how to deploy, just so it's a little different than part 1, so it's not just the same thing, but 2 different deployment maps. So in this deployment guide, we want to talk about a few other things. What if the opponent has indirect, our scope moves, how to deploy for some early secondary scoring and board control, pile in and consolidate, where are the high danger areas of the board, how protected is the home objective, which objectives in no man's land will be the easiest to hold, and like I always say, plan our first turn and plan ahead. The first deployment map we will start with will be Search and Destroy. We will start with deploying against Tau with the ranged heavy units, followed by the World Eaters. Like part 1, I have some images to go over to help explain my mindset when I deploy my Adeptus Custodes on a Search and Destroy map. There's no script for this one, I'm just going by what I see here. Sorry if things don't sound as uniform as they usually do. For our first examples for Search and Destroy, we'll have the Tau versus a Infantry Custodes list. If the opponent has some indirect weapons, the answer usually is to keep your Draxes and Custodian Guard on the objective. The home objective, you can use her ability that she cannot be targeted by anything outside of 18 inches, so it will help that unit protect it against indirect fire and help us hold our home objective. If there's no indirect fire, you just want to throw some prosecutors on there and use your tanks or any other infantry you may have to help screen that objective until after all the enemy reserve units are placed on the board. And for this Search and Destroy map, we'll take a little look at which objectives are probably the easiest ones to hold. 9 times out of 10, the one closest to your deployment, quite easy to get and quite easy to hold for a lot of the game. The center objective can be a different story. How easy is it to hold? Is there any line of sight cover? And will I get shot off the board or charge off the board if I get onto this objective early? And for the center objective for this map, there is a little spot you can get inside these ruins. Other than that, you would have to stand right out and then open there to hold this objective. So if we do have to go onto this objective, we run on there with some wardens, we pop our Fort Funeral Pain, and just hope we can tank the shooting that we are going to take. But like I said, you don't want to run up there turn 1 and attempt to tank the entire army. If we can get up there in some line of sight cover, that's what you want to do with your wardens. You also want to look for those high danger areas. On this map, by these craters, so we may get stuck trying to run from this backed objective to the center objective if we need to get there. There's a lot of open areas there. See which objectives are going to be easier to take, and when we do take these objectives, which objective is going to be easier to hold. Because sometimes the objective might be a little harder to take, but once you take that objective, it'll be even harder for the enemy to come take it back from us. As you can see here from my deployment, I have everything in some line of sight cover. I don't want to risk losing any models turn 1 or having to use my Warden's Fort Funeral Pain before I even get to move my models. So everything's behind cover. The Witchseekers are out there, but they can scout into some cover if I don't get turn 1. And for this infantry list, I do have my 2 units of 3 Venatari and Deep Strike along with a unit of Blade Champions with some Wardens. Let's take a look at the other side of the board at the Tau and how they will be deploying if we have an all infantry list. Spoiler, everything's going to be out in the shot lanes. And as you can see here, everything is out. Everything is ready to shoot us if we have to stop any of these shot lanes. If they get any lines of sight on us, they're going to shoot us with everything they have. They don't have to worry about us shooting back at them. Even if we get close enough to shoot our Guardian Spears at them, it's just not enough threat to keep shooting units from just parking in the shot lanes, waiting for the Custodes to come out. So we have to be smart when we're playing all infantry. We have to watch out for these shot lanes because they are going to be covered with a lot of guns. And I do have 2 Witchseekers in this list just to show how I would use my scope moves when I'm using the Custodes, especially when I have my Witchseekers. And for the Search and Destroy deployment examples, we're going to go with the scenario that the Custodes went first. For tipping point, we'll have the Custodes go second, just to show you my mindset of what I do if I go first or if I go second. Going first here in Search and Destroy, we're going to push our scouts as close as we can to these objectives so we can hopefully advance on them if we need to, or even just move on to them to do any kind of secondaries like cleanse or aerial denial or anything like that. Now let's take a quick look at the shot lanes and how they will look with an all infantry list deploying against a mostly ranged list. As you can see here, they have all the big guns like the broadsides, all the riptides ready to shoot down the lanes at us. If we get any of these lanes, if we stand in the open at all, we're going to be shot. So it has to be worth it when we're doing it. If we're going up the board, we have no choice to get onto an objective to stand out in the open. We can use that for feel no pain, but we have to make sure there's a little bit of protection and there's a reason for going out in the open. The Custodes are going first in the scenario, so this is what I would do with my first turn. I would pretty much advance everything up the board to get as much board control as I can. I'm not looking to make any turn 1 charges against the Tau. If I charge into those stealth suits close to the middle there, I will be in range of all the guns. I don't want to use the 4 feel no pain. Where those wardens are standing now, they're quite safe. The Tau will have to go around to shoot me because we're playing these ruins have no windows. So they'll have to go around to shoot those wardens in the middle with Valerian. So they should be a little safer from the guns. If I move out around there, if I move into the middle at all, I will get shot by a lot of guns. And even with the 4 feel no pain, I don't want to take the chance of being shot by an entire army of Tau turn 1. And the Witchseekers on the left there have advanced as far as they can to get into some line of sight cover to be on that objective and hold that. So now the Tau will have to come dig them out. And if they do, we have some units in reserve that we can rapid ingress down to take care of the threat that's coming for that objective. And down below here with the Wardens and the Blade Champion, they're just going to stay there. They're going to be a countercharge threat for the middle or push up into that other no man's land objective closer to the Tau deployment. But for now, they'll stay there as a countercharge threat, and then I can decide what I want to do with them later on. But you want to have a little bit of a plan for what you're doing. You don't just want to stay in there because you have nothing to do. I do want to use these as a countercharge threat. They are doing something, even if they are just staying where they are. And that's a Custodes infantry deployment against a Tau range list. Now let's look at this deployment if we did have some of those Custodes Grav-tanks in the list. And for this list, we'll use the same list that Folger Piles used to win the World Championship with. And here's the deployment if we're using the tank list, that Folger Piles list. We do have the Blade Champion with the Wardens in Deep Strike Reserve, and the 2 Custodes tanks have started on the board here, but they are in cover because we don't want them getting shot turn 1. These are going to be counter shooting platforms, so when the Tau come out, we can shoot at them. We don't want to be the first one coming out with our tanks. We want to come out after the opponent has started exposing some of their important units that we want to target with these tanks. And as you can see here, everything is some line of sight cover. They might be able to get that Piranha down there and get some shots onto the Wardens behind that train car there, but for most part, they are safe from everything. So this is how I deploy with my tanks. I still want everything in some line of sight cover. I don't want to deploy too aggressive, and I want to start planning my turn 1 and even some of my turn 2 as early as I can. Now let's take a look at the Tau side. The Tau here have deployed a lot more of their units in line of sight cover. The broadsides aren't sitting out in all the shot lanes ready to fire at us because the Tau don't want us to go turn 1, bring our tanks out, and then start shooting some of their big high damage units off the table. And this is the big difference between deploying with an infantry list and a list with some long range anti-tank threat. As you can see here, it's a lot more clear in these shot lanes, not full of Tau guns waiting to blow us to pieces. They're a lot more reserved. They don't want us to shoot back at them first. So there's a lot more of these Tau units in some line of sight cover waiting for us to come out, but not right in these shot lanes. Scope movements. We scope these Witchseekers towards the middle as far as we can, and we bring the Witchseekers inside the Rhino, since the Witchseekers do give a Rhino a 6-inch scout as long as the Witchseekers are the only unit in there, or as long as all the units inside the Rhino have the scout ability. So I've scouted 6 inches with the Rhino. In this scenario, we are going first, so we are going to push our scout units as far towards these objectives as we can, because we want to grab these early, especially if we get cleanse or anything like that turn 1. In a lot of my games, I'm not pushing to grab these primary with my Custodes units in turn 1. I want to grab them with my chaff and wait to see what my opponent does before I start throwing my Custodes willy-nilly around the board. See what the opponent's doing and start planning for your next turn. Turn 1, even with tanks, we're just going to push our army out, but not too aggressive. We don't want to get into his shot lanes early. We want to get onto his objectives if we can. Get some secondary points if we can for turn 1. The more points, the better. We're not trying to kill everything turn 1. Our tanks are still going to sit here behind cover, because like I said, they are counter-shooting units. We want to wait for the Tau or any other army with some long-range firepower to bring that firepower out before we shoot at it. Because we are Custodes, we can be afforded to be shot at, especially if you still have that 4-up feel no pain. And having that 4-up feel no pain, it makes us so much harder to kill. So the chances of the opponent bringing out a considerable amount of firepower to take out those Wardens is quite high, bringing them out to be shot at by our Custodes tanks. So there is a little bit of synergy between the Wardens and the tanks, because the Wardens help us get the enemy out into places to be shot at by the tanks. Now we have a relatively tough unit on this objective with that Rhino. We can get out with those Witchers in turn 2, leaving that Rhino there to hold that objective. Rhino is a Psychonic unit, so it helps spread that 6 inches of 5 of funeral pain to mortals and psychic damage. And that's my deployment against a ranged army for the Search and Destroy. So let's look at the World Eaters in a melee heavy list that's going to be flying at us turn 1. Let's move on to Search and Destroy if we're playing the World Eaters or another melee heavy that's quite fast, that's going to be in our face turn 1 or turn 2 at the latest. As you can see here, I've used the Witchseekers to block off a lot of the charges into my Wardens, and I didn't really have that 4 inches in between them just to stop any consolidates or pylon, because I'm not really worried about anything consolidating into these Wardens units, because we would get to hit back, and I don't want to give the Wardens any more board control. So I do have a lot of my units on the line, but they're going to be screened by some Witchseekers who are going to be able to scout ahead 6 inches and block off even more of the board. So we will get that 4-inch distance in between these units, so we won't be able to get piled in or consolidate. But we also didn't lose a whole bunch of board control because we deployed really far back. Then we can use these Witchseekers to push out our lines, have the World Eaters slam into those Witchseekers. Yes, they're going to die, but then we are going to run forward with our Wardens and smash the World Eaters into pieces. As you can expect, against an All Infantry Custodes list, the World Eaters are going to be deployed right on the line. They're going to try to get on us turn 1. They're going to try to get on objectives, get some early points, put some pressure on us. They don't have to worry about being shot off the board. Angron doesn't have to worry about being shot by any Custodes Grav-tanks. All infantry, everything's going to be on the line. And as you can see here, I've used my scouts from these Witchseekers to push up as far as I can. I want to push up this break line so the World Eaters can crash into that. Even though in the scenario we are going turn 1, I still want to push these Witchseekers out as far as they can go with that 6-inch scout. Turn 1 for the Custodes, I want to push my army out as far as I can. I want to get as much board control. I want to push these World Eaters as far back as I can, because they're going to be coming, they're going to be advancing, charging, they're going to be doing the same thing, getting me locked in my deployment. So turn 1, I want to take the advantage to get as much board control as I can. Push these Witchseekers in their face, advance them as far as I can. We are going to lose them, but we want to be able to charge them, because if we can get a big bunch of their army smashing into these Witchseekers and them being stuck there, they can't consolidate into us, we're going to have a great time charging into them. Strength 7, so their toughness 6, exalted 8 bound, are going to be wounded on 3s. Even if they have a 6 up, feel no pain, and they roll hot, we're still going to tear down enough of these units so they won't be a threat anymore. The Wardens have pushed ahead as well to create a big line, blocking off some of my squishier units from some of these World Eaters. Yes, Angron can fly over the Witchseeker screen, but you're going to pop the 4 up funeral pain if he charges into them. You might lose them all, but for the most part, you're still going to have a Warden or 2 left. The Blade Champion will get to swing back, and the next turn, we can just slam all of our Wardens and Blade Champions into Angron and tear him down. But for the most part, this is how I'm going to deploy and do my first turn against the World Eaters. I want board control. I'm not worried about trying to gain advances and charges. I want them to hit my Witchseekers first and then countercharge them. Now let's take a look at Search and Destroy against the World Eaters if we had some tanks in the list. The deployment will look quite similar, but the threat of those tanks will keep Angron from being right on the line, ready to charge at us. For the most part, the World Eaters will not want to take the risk of losing Angron turn 1 before he gets to do anything. The infantry have deployed similar. We do have the Witchseekers ready to scout ahead to push that World Eater line back as far as we can. And like last time, we do have a group of Wardens in here just to be a buffer, because we don't have enough Witchseekers to screen out everything. But we do want to have a tough unit, so if some units do get to squeak through, they have to go through the Wardens. They don't go into Draxus, they don't go into the tanks. They have to go into some tough Wardens, and then we pop that 4 up Feel No Pain. Our scouting is going to be the same as the infantry list. Scout ahead, push the exalted 8-bound movement back as far as we can. Try to screen as much as we can from charges. The tanks are going to wait for Angron or any other big juicy targets to come out before they move ahead, because we want to keep our Wardens and our other units to screen these tanks. They are important, and especially when Angron shows up, we want to be able to put some damage on him without having to charge him. The World Eaters' home objective will usually be an easier target than a ranged army. They're going to be pushing a lot of their army ahead, so we will have some good chances to wrap an ingress down there and push their home objective to hopefully cause some of these World Eaters to turn around to try to take their home objective back. The middle objective is going to be a very dangerous objective to hold. There are so many World Eaters that are going to be charged us if we get onto this objective early. We may have to wait until some of the World Eaters charge into our screen lines, countercharge them back, smash some of them down before we can start grabbing the center objective. We may even want to ignore it together and go for the 2 other objectives in no man's land. It depends on what happens in turn 1. It depends on how many World Eaters come flying at us, get stuck in the screen, and let us chop them up in our turn. They may opt to instead to run onto these objectives with their fast speed, try to screen us out, and wait for us to charge in. The better players aren't going to run their entire army at you turn 1 unless you've left yourself open to some really good charges. And that's my deployment on the Search and Destroy against a melee heavy army, an aggressive army that doesn't have a lot of shooting, so we don't have to worry about not deploying in the shot lanes, but we do have to worry about deploying so we don't get charged turn 1 and we don't lose important units turn 1. Next up is Tipping Point, and this will be the second deployment map of the video. Once again, we will use the Tau and the World Eaters as our example armies. We have the same Custodes list for these example images as well. Tipping Point is one of the new deployment maps that came in the Pariah Nexus update in summer 2024. We will start with the Custodes infantry list against the Tau range list in this Tipping Point example. And the Tau have already grabbed the objective close to their deployment. Objective closest to our deployment, in the one in the center that does have some stealth units on it as well. Those are the objectives that are probably going to be the easiest to get turn 1 and turn 2. The home objective will have a lot of screens and other units around it for a lot of the game, since the Tau have a mostly ranged army. So we may want to push that other objective in no man's land if we have to, but the home objective probably isn't going to be able to be taken anytime soon, so I wouldn't plan to be taking that. I would try to plan to hold at least 2 objectives in the no man's land and just try to disrupt the Tau scoring as much as we can. Same as Search and Destroy, we want to deploy where we have most of our army in line of sight cover. So if we don't get turn 1, we don't lose a whole bunch of models and get shot off the board turn 1. I do have these Wardens out in the open a little bit with these Witchseekers. I deployed them last, so there's not as many guns that can shoot them turn 1, and if I do need to, I can pop that Fort Funeral Pain, because if I can get on that objective behind that line of sight cover, it's going to be really hard for the Tau to come up and take that back from me, and that's why I do take the risk here of taking some shots, but for the chance of getting this objective early and making it really hard for the Tau to come take, and that frees up a lot of the rest of my army to go out and do other things and disrupt some Tau scoring. And the Tau deployment is going to be the same as Search and Destroy. If we're running an infantry list, no matter what the deployment, all the enemy guns are going to be out in the shot lanes waiting for us to come out. If we don't have anything to threaten the back, there's no reason for them not to be standing out in the shot lanes, especially if they do have some weapons that have the heavy keyword. That way they don't have to worry about moving and losing that +1 to hit. For these tipping point scenarios, the enemy faction will have the first turn. So the Tau are going to push out quite hard to get some shots onto as many infantry as they can, because they don't have to worry about any tanks coming out to shoot them back, so everything's going to get as far as they can ahead, but not too far ahead, just so they can avoid any advances and charges. So they're going to push up the piranhas to move block us. Everything is going to come out, and this is why, if we need to, we can pop that Fort Funeral Pain on that bottom left Blade Champion unit. In our turn, we're going to push up hard. We want to grab these objectives early, get in some line of sight cover. We need to force the Tau to come to us. We can't go to the Tau. We're too slow to run at them. Yes, we have the Blade Champions for advancing, charging, but if they just put some chaff, we can't get at everything at the same time. We do need to be careful. We want the Tau to come to us. We want them to come around the corners to get some line of sight, use our Fort Funeral Pains then, use our toughness, tank a bunch of the shots, and then run out and then chop them to pieces. We need to keep them off these objectives, keep scoring points, because we may not have much of an army at the end against a high shooting list, but we want to score as many points early as we can, just so we can get so far ahead in points that these shooting armies just can't catch us. The next example is the World Eaters against a list with some tanks in it. Even before the game starts, we want to plan and deploy where we can get some objectives early. And so in this one, it looks like we'll be able to grab that objective early with those Witchseekers close to our deployment zone, grab that objective early. The center objective, we may want to wait until the World Eaters grab that and then countercharge them. Then we have that objective in no man's land that is closest to the World Eaters deployment. The same thing with Search and Destroy, that the World Eaters will eventually leave their home objective a lot less protected than a shooting list that's going to have a lot of screens back there, a lot of units with long range firepower. The World Eaters have to come at us. They're going to leave some of these objectives open. And where are their high danger areas of the board? It's going to be mid-board. They're going to come flying at us. We cannot afford to have them charge us first. We need to countercharge the World Eaters. We don't have -1 damage. We just don't have enough survivability against all that attacks. If we lose too many models in a unit, we just won't be able to hit back hard enough. We need to screen. We need to look and see where a lot of these World Eaters will be coming from. Even if we can't screen them all, if we can screen a large majority of them, we can deal with them. If we can deal with them a few units at a time, then we are golden. Wait for that first wave that's going to be flying us to slam into us, screen them out well, countercharge them, and then start getting onto these objectives, scoring early. Right now, for World Eaters and other fast melee armies, we don't want to worry about scoring as much as screening and ready for the charge and ready for a good counterattack. We need a good counterattack against an aggressive army. Same as Search and Destroy, when we have these tanks on the board, Angron won't be standing there in the open. They just can't afford to lose him turn 1 without him doing anything. There is a War Dog out there being a little bit brave, hoping to get a turn 1 charge. If the World Eaters go turn 1, that other Warglaive is hiding behind the train car because it doesn't want to get shot off the board turn 1. So that is the big difference. Having these tanks really changes the dynamic of how opponents deploy their units. It's such a shame that these tanks are so hard to get. They're so expensive because right now they're such an essential part of our army. So many tanks and monsters and other high damage, high toughness units running around. We really need these tanks to help give us some long range threat. That is not to say that you can't win without these tanks. You can win with infantry lists. It's a little bit harder because we don't have that long range tank support, but we usually have a few more strong units on the board for holding objectives. But right now, the trade-off for not bringing some long range damage is a little bit higher than not having it. These tipping point scenarios have the opponent going first, so the World Eaters are going first. We want to scout as far as ahead as we can because they are going to be coming at us. Even if they don't get advanced in charge, they're going to be coming at us to get some board control. So we want to try to move block them as much as we can. No, we're not going to be able to block them or deployment zone, but we are going to keep them from being able to push us so hard that we can't get to our deployment zone. Push the Witchseekers up, create a line as long as you can between them without breaking coherency, so we can hopefully stop a big line of these World Eaters slamming into our important units. And here I'll show you what it can look like if the World Eaters play a little more conservative. If they're not looking to charge you and just try to get in a melee as soon as they can, if they're more looking to win the game and use their units to a little more to score instead of just kill everything, this is what it can look like. It's not going to have everything charging at you turn 1. It's going to be having everything staging, getting objectives, ready for their turn 2. And here is a little rough idea of what I would do in my turn 1. I would bring my tank out to get some shots onto that little knight. I would push as much as my units over towards that objective with my Witchseekers and the Witchseekers with the Rhino, so I could still screen out a lot of the army. Push the Wardens with Valerian out there. I wouldn't charge because I want him to charge into Valerian. Valerian has that -1 to the AP of incoming melee attacks. Pop that Fort Funeral Pain. This would be to try to get those big blocks of units on the center objective on the other side. Shoot them up with Draxus and the Custodian Guard. If I do charge them, they do have a Master of Executions in there to fight first. So I may want to try to bait them onto my side of the wall. We also have to worry about Angron there. And since the World Eaters went turn 1, and they didn't run at us turn 1, they staged, got on objectives early. We need to decide which of these objectives in no man's land we are going to be able to take. Angron over there in the other objective, we want to stay away from that for now. If we can get Angron to come into us, charge into those Witchseekers, or make the wrong move where we can get some shots on him from the Custodes tanks, get rid of him and then maybe push on the objective and ignore the middle. It all depends on how quickly we can get rid of that big giant blob of World Eaters in the middle, or if we want to try ignore that, get them to spread out, try different tactics. But we do want to start planning on what you want to do in your turn 2, because turn 1 is staging, trying to get these World Eaters to come out a little bit more to get some shots and some good charges on them. If you look, we do have that Rhino in a good area to block that little knight from coming down and getting any charges onto my Custodes tank in case I do whiff on the shooting phase. And we may not worry about anything consolidating into us like some Exalted 8-bound or anything like that, because a lot of times if you consolidate into a Custodes unit that has not fought yet, they're going to tear you to pieces. But when Angron's on the board, we do want to make sure we place ourselves around where there's not a lot of area for him to land his big base in, because he can fly over our units when he charges. So we want to make sure there's no room for him to land any good places to get some really good charges on us, especially in the first turn where a lot of our units are clumped together. Make sure there's no room for Angron to land anywhere and chop up some of our important units. That is my Custodes guide for the tipping point deployment. Let's move on to some final thoughts. Let's finish with some final thoughts. I do apologize again if this video seemed a bit rough. I think it was a bit more clean than part 1 though. This by no means is an end-all be-all deployment, just some helpful tips I have picked up on playing the Custodes. Part 3 will be out in the next week or so to finish off the series. If you have any suggestions to make these deployment guide series better, throw it in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe for weekly battle reports, list videos, boarding actions, and other Warhammer 40K content. Like I always say, thanks for watching, thanks for stopping by.